I built my garden to survive grief. After my wife died, it was the only thing that made me feel human again.
Digging.
Planting. Watching something grow in a world that had taken everything from me. Then my neighbor reported me. Said it violated city code. Called me a pest risk. Said my flowers were bringing down the neighborhood. One letter later, and my entire backyard was shut down. Months of work, gone. I had to rip up beds, take down trellises, cover up the only piece I had left. And the whole time, she watched from her porch smiling like she won something. But what she didn't know was that her house? It was built on a ticking time bomb. Unstable soil, weak foundation, and a drainage problem just waiting to get worse. I didn't touch her property. I didn't break a single law. All I did
Was step back.
and let nature handle the revenge. So when her patio cracked and her home started to sink, she thought it was bad luck. It wasn't. She buried my garden in red tape. So I buried her house in the truth. I'm a guy in my early 60s, and for most of my adult life, I worked in city planning. Not the flashy part, no big skyscrapers or ribbon cuttings. Just the quiet, tedious stuff. Zoning maps, soil integrity reports, floodplain ordinances. It was a job that made other people yawn, but I liked it. There was something peaceful about reading the land and planning around it, figuring out what would last and what would eventually fall. I retired a year after my wife, Claire, passed. Cancer.
Fast. Ugly.
I was alone in our house after 37 years together. It was too quiet, too still. I needed something to fill the silence. So I turned to the backyard. Claire had always wanted a garden, a real one. Not just a few potted herbs, but a wild, colorful sanctuary. Roses, lavender, tomatoes, wild basil. We used to talk about building it after I retired. She never made it that far. But I did. And I was damn well going to build it for the both of us. It became my therapy. I spent hours out there every morning, tearing up weeds, digging out old roots, leveling the earth. The sun on my neck, the sound of birds, the smell of soil. It gave me a reason to get out of bed. Neighbors would walk by and wave. Some stopped to say how nice it looked. Brings life to the whole street, one of them said. I added a stone archway with creeping vines. Built my own compost bins from reclaimed cedar. Even designed a little irrigation system using gravity-fed barrels. It wasn't just a garden. It was a project. A promise kept. Every time something bloomed, I felt like I was talking to her again. The house next door had been vacant for a few years. Foreclosure. Flood damage. Then last spring, it sold to a woman named Margaret. Early 70s, single, hair in a tight gray bun, lips always pressed like she was tasting something bitter. Moved in with a puffed-up sense of authority and a clipboard. I said hello the first day. She didn't look up from unpacking her porch furniture. No big deal.
Some people need time.
I went back to my garden, kept my head down. But a week later, I noticed her standing at the edge of her lawn, just staring at my yard. Not waving, not smiling, just staring. I gave her a nod. She turned and went back inside. Didn't think much of it, but it wouldn't be the last time I caught her watching. And that's when I started to get the feeling that she didn't move here for peace and quiet. She moved here to control. It started small. One Saturday morning, I was trimming back the lavender when I heard her voice for the first time. You know, she said, arms folded across her cardigan, those trellises aren't exactly what I'd call neighborhood-friendly. I looked up confused. Sorry? She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the archway I'd built over the gravel path. Those things. They're tall. And they weren't here when I toured this street. I smiled politely. They're temporary. Just for the vines to grow on. She didn't smile back. Just be careful. Property values don't rise on their own. Then she walked off. No wave. No goodbye. I stood there, pruning shears in hand, wondering what the hell that even meant. Later that week, I found a plastic grocery bag tied to my compost bin. Inside was a stack of moldy bread and what smelled like rotting chicken. Not mine. I compost kitchen scraps, but carefully. No meat, no mess. I figured maybe an animal dropped it. Or a kid. Until it happened again. Same bag. Same kind of trash. I moved the bin behind a lattice screen, added a lock to the lid. Problem solved. Or so I thought. The real hit came 2 weeks later. I opened my mailbox and found a letter from the city. A formal violation notice. Unpermitted structures identified on property. Potential pest hazard due to compost. Landscaping features encroaching beyond legal setback limits. I stared at it like it was written in another language. They included photos. Grainy, zoomed-in shots of my trellises. My compost bins. Even a close-up of my rain barrels with the caption, "Unsecured water catchment. Mosquito risk." Someone had reported me. And it didn't take a genius to figure out who. The only new face on the block. The only person who seemed offended by flowers. Margaret. I knocked on her door the next day. Tried to keep it neighborly.
Tried.
"Hi there," I said. "Did you, by any chance, contact the city about my garden?" She didn't open the screen door. Just stood there behind it like I was selling knives. Her voice was syrupy and smug. "Oh, I'm not sure what you mean." I held up the letter. "Someone submitted these. With photos. From your side of the fence." She tilted her head. "Well, if someone did, it was probably out of concern. You know, bugs, mold, unsightly clutter." I felt my jaw tighten. "I'm following all guidelines," I said. "This garden's been here for months. No one else has complained." She shrugged. "Then you have nothing to worry about, do you?" And then she smiled. A thin, satisfied smile. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't about gardening. It wasn't about rules. It was about her wanting a fight. And now she had won. I spent the next week scrambling to meet the city's demands. I took down the archway, moved the compost bins even farther from the fence, covered the rain barrels, replanted the edge of the garden to stay within the legal setback. It felt like erasing memories, one shovel at a time. And through it all, Margaret watched. Sometimes from her porch, sometimes from the upstairs window. She didn't wave, didn't speak, but I could feel her satisfaction. She won the first round, and she wanted me to know it. I tried to stay civil, told myself, she's just bitter or lonely or one of those people who needs control to feel important. Claire would have told me to take the high road. But then the petty stuff started. My sprinkler system stopped working one morning. At first, I thought it was a clog. But when I opened the valve box, I found a rock shoved inside, jamming it shut. No way that was an accident. A few days later, my bird feeder pole was snapped in half.
Clean break.
Like someone had taken a saw to it. Then came the trash. Little piles of food wrappers and half-eaten fruit appeared near my back fence. Every couple of days. Always on my side. I installed a small motion sensor light. The next morning it was smashed. I went to the HOA, thinking maybe they could mediate or at least put something on record. They gave me polite nods and told me they'd look into it. But Margaret had already gotten to them. One of the board members, Tony, leaned in and whispered, "She's been emailing us about you for weeks. Claims your yard's attracting pests. That you're disrupting neighborhood harmony." Neighborhood harmony? I was planting marigolds and tomatoes. She was waging a psychological war. And now she was painting me as the villain. One night, I stayed up past midnight. No lights. Just me and the window, watching. Sure enough, movement. A figure crept along the side of my fence. Stopped. Leaned over.
Dropped something.
I slipped outside with a flashlight and shined it straight at her. "Margaret," I called. She froze like a deer, then scurried back into the shadows, mumbling something about just checking on things. I didn't bother chasing her. That was the moment I stopped playing defense. Because I knew something she didn't. Her house, the one she clung to like a throne, was hiding a secret. A dangerous one. And I was the only person on this street who knew exactly where to find it. You don't go to war with someone like Margaret by tossing garbage back over the fence. You wait. You gather. And when the moment's right, you bury them in their own dirt. Literally, in her case. But before that, things had to get worse. Because Margaret wasn't finished. She'd tested the waters. Saw that the HOA didn't shut her down. Saw that the city made me rip up part of the garden. And now, she went for the kill. First, she reported me again, this time anonymously, but the style was obvious. Said I was stockpiling greywater, which is code for using unsafe irrigation. The barrels had sealed lids. I wasn't even violating any regulations anymore. But the city showed up again, did another inspection, left me with a warning. Then she started spreading rumors. Apparently, I was unstable. A hoarder. Someone who let things rot in the backyard. A neighbor I barely knew, Marlene, stopped me one afternoon while I was pulling weeds. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, lowering her voice like I might snap. "I'm fine," I said.
Why?
She hesitated. "It's just, Margaret said you had traps in your yard. For people." I actually laughed out loud. "Traps? You think I'm setting booby traps out here?" "She said you threatened her," she added quickly. "With chemicals?" I blinked. She made that up. But by then, the damage was done. Neighbors who used to wave suddenly crossed the street instead. I became the weird recluse with the spooky backyard. Margaret, meanwhile, hosted tea on her porch with the neighborhood ladies. You could practically hear the gossip echoing off the fence. Still, I kept quiet, because I was remembering something. Back when I worked for the city, my wife Claire used to work in private zoning consultation. And years ago, she told me about a property with serious foundation risk. The owner back then had tried to build without proper reinforcement. They filled in unstable ground with cheap gravel and topsoil instead of compacting clay. It had been flagged as a liability. Too expensive to fix. That lot, the one Margaret now stood on, that was it. Claire even kept a scanned copy of the original soil reports on her old hard drive. I dug them up that night. There it was. Lot 17A. Subsurface fill identified as low compaction, high moisture retention. Not recommended for permanent structure without deep pilings. Translation? Margaret's house was sitting on garbage dirt. One good shift in groundwater flow, and it could start to sink. And guess what Margaret had done since moving in? Installed a full sprinkler system. Ran it every morning for over an hour. Laid sod, thick flower beds, and poured a concrete patio in the back without permits. The water had nowhere to go. So I gave it somewhere to go. See, I'd built that garden with more than just flowers. I'd mapped out the slope of the whole block when I designed the irrigation. I knew where every puddle wanted to end up. With a few adjustments, a rerouted trench here, an extra rain barrel overflow outlet there. I guided runoff ever so gently toward her fence line. Didn't flood her. Didn't damage anything. Just helped gravity do its thing. I even cleared out one of the old French drains that used to snake underground before the last owner plugged it up. It just so happened to direct moisture under her concrete patio. Then I waited and watched. Fall brought a steady drizzle that lingered for weeks. I never saw her outside with that smug teacup anymore. But I did notice new cracks in her retaining wall, a slow sag in the fence posts, and a fresh patch of dirt at the corner of her patio, sinking ever so slightly every few days. One morning, I spotted her pacing the side of her house on the phone, waving her arm like she was angry. By the time the holidays rolled around, her back door wouldn't close all the way. A neighbor told me she was calling contractors for foundation issues. And I just nodded, watered my dahlias, and waited for the ground to make its move. By January, things started falling apart, literally. Margaret had two men out with measuring tape and clipboards, stomping through her backyard in heavy boots. I watched from my porch as they poked the concrete with rebar rods and scribbled notes with grim faces. I already knew what they were going to find. I could have saved them the trouble. But I was enjoying the show. The next morning, a third truck rolled up. A foundation specialist. They drilled into the soil and ran a camera into one of the ground seams that had split beneath her back steps. I could hear the whirring from my kitchen window. A week later, yellow tape went up around part of her yard. Not police tape, just a caution warning from her insurance company. Then the cherry on top. A bright orange sign posted in her window. Structural review required. Do not alter foundation. The city had flagged her property. Apparently, the water damage had reached her load-bearing supports. And because she never disclosed the past risk when she bought the place, her insurance refused to pay. She tried to fight it, of course, claimed it was sudden or sabotage. She even tried dragging me into it. One afternoon, I stepped out to find a city code inspector waiting by my mailbox. Said Margaret accused me of diverting water onto her property intentionally. I didn't flinch. I handed him the same soil reports I'd pulled from Claire's old files. Showed him the original foundation survey. Pointed out that her house had already been red-flagged years ago, long before she ever moved in. And then I dropped the final bomb. I actually warned her, I said. Send a letter when she moved in. Let her know that the lot had prior issues and that her patio might not hold. He blinked. You have a copy? I pulled it from a folder. It was a polite letter, typed, dated, with a copy of the relevant zoning note attached. I even highlighted the sentence. Not recommended for additional hardscape without compaction reinforcement. The inspector whistled low. Well, that changes things. By the end of the week, the case against me was dropped. Margaret, meanwhile, was in damage control. She sent out emails to the HOA trying to paint me as vindictive and obsessed with sabotage. But when Tony, the same HOA board guy who'd warned me about her gossip, called a meeting, it backfired. He stood up in front of everyone and said, Margaret, your foundation is failing because of poor construction and overwatering. And this man, he pointed to me, warned you. You ignored it. End of story.
She tried to yell back.
Said something about my barrels and water flow. But the room was silent. All the neighbors who used to avoid me? Now, they were staring at her. Because when it came down to it, they all knew I kept to myself. Never caused trouble. And Margaret had turned the block into a battlefield. That night, I stood in my yard and looked over the fence. Her once pristine lawn was now covered in dirt mounds, caution tape, and busted patio stones. She came outside and saw me there. For the first time, she was the one avoiding eye contact. She didn't say a word.
Just looked at the mess.
Then at me. And I gave her the same polite nod I gave on the day she moved in. Except this time, it meant something different. You brought this on yourself. A month later, her backyard looked like a crime scene. Chunks of concrete torn up. Orange safety cones around cracked walkways. An open trench along the side of the house where engineers tried to inject stabilization foam. It was all too late. The ground had shifted too much. Too deep. Too fast. And the real kicker? It wasn't covered by her homeowner's insurance. Because of pre-existing structural concerns. The same concerns I had tried to warn her about. In writing. Before she even unpacked her first box. And now, it was all coming back to bury her.
Literally.
Then came the HOA meeting. Tony called it as a way to review current disputes and complaints after the neighborhood had been caught in the crossfire of Margaret's antics for months. It was held in the community center down the block. I almost didn't go, but something told me I needed to be there. Margaret showed up late, flustered, wearing sunglasses indoors like someone trying to dodge the spotlight. But it found her anyway. The second the floor opened for discussion, she shot her hand up. I want it on record, she said, that I believe my property damage was deliberate sabotage. A murmur spread across the room. Tony raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof of that?
She pointed at me.
He's been rerouting water into my yard for months. I stood up calmly. No, Margaret. I routed water away from mine. Gravity handled the rest. A few people laughed under their breath. Tony leaned forward. Margaret, you've accused your neighbor of a serious offense. He already provided documentation from zoning records. You ignored the warning. Margaret's voice rose. He's lying. He planned this. He built a trap. I reached into my folder, held up a printed email, dated and time-stamped, sent her shortly after she moved in. I emailed you this, I said, reading aloud. Please be aware that your property was flagged years ago for unstable fill. Avoid installing heavy fixtures like patios or retaining walls without soil testing. Dead silence. Someone in the back whispered, Wait, she knew. Tony took the paper from me, glanced it over, and nodded. It checks out. Margaret's face turned a shade of red I didn't know was possible. You people don't understand, she snapped. He's twisted this whole thing. I was just trying to keep the neighborhood clean. Another neighbor, Marlene, stood up. No, Margaret. You harassed him. You lied to all of us. You had me thinking he was dangerous, like he was some unstable hoarder. But it was you taking pictures over the fence. You spread the garbage. Now several people were nodding. Tony cleared his throat.
Enough.
We've reviewed the complaints. The board agrees there's no violation on my name as property. There's no further action to take. And as for your foundation issues, Margaret, that's between you, your builder, and the soil under your feet. Margaret stood up like she was going to storm out, but there wasn't anywhere to storm to. She just hovered, stunned, humiliated. People watched her go with quiet, satisfied stares. No sympathy. No allies. No control left. And as she passed me near the exit, she didn't say a word.
Didn't look at me.
Just clutched her handbag like she was trying to disappear into it. For the first time since she moved in, she looked small. And all I had to do was tell the truth. Let the ground do the rest. Margaret put the house up for sale 3 months later. Listed it as a minor foundation issue, price to sell. It sat on the market for weeks. Then months. Word had spread. Buyers came, but the moment they saw the cracked patio and leaning fence line, they backed out. Eventually, she sold it at a massive loss. Tens of thousands under what she paid. The day the moving truck came, I stood at my garden gate, sipping coffee. She didn't say goodbye. Just climbed into the passenger seat of the van and pulled the door shut behind her. I didn't wave, didn't smile, just turned and went back to pruning the rosemary bush. It was finally blooming again. A few weeks later, the new owners arrived. Young couple, early 30s. Friendly. The guy asked me if I liked gardening. I told him it was my therapy. He smiled. Said he and his wife were hoping to grow vegetables in the side yard. I helped them set up a raised bed. Even gave them some seedlings from Claire's old planters. We talk often now. They wave every time they pass. Sometimes we trade tomatoes for herbs. The yard is peaceful again. The birds came back. So did the butterflies. I finally rebuilt the archway. Sturdier this time. Stronger. Funny thing about revenge. It doesn't always come with fire and fury. Sometimes it comes with roots, with time, with quiet. And sometimes you don't have to destroy anything. You just have to step back and let the ground tell the truth. Underscore 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 underscore. Final line. She buried my garden in red tape. I buried her house in truth.